Imagine stepping outside your front door with a long journey ahead of you. No GPS, no highway patrol cruising the road ahead, no emergency number to call if something goes wrong. Just you, a horse if you were lucky, and hundreds of miles of dark, dense, untamed wilderness stretching out before you. Now imagine that somewhere in those trees, someone might be waiting not to ask for directions, but to rob you or worse. This was not a nightmare. This was simply Tuesday in colonial America. For the men and women of the 1700s, travel was not an inconvenience to be managed. It was a life-and-death gamble undertaken without a single uniformed officer to keep you safe. The question was never whether danger existed on the road. The question was whether you would survive it. To understand just how terrifyingly exposed travelers were in early America, you first need to understand what the land actually looked like, and more importantly, what it did not have. The 13 colonies were vast, sprawling, and overwhelmingly wild. The forests were dense enough to block out the midday sun on even the most well-traveled paths. The roads, if they could be called that, were often nothing more than widened Native American trails, sometimes only 12 to 18 inches across and worn a foot deep into the earth by generations of footsteps. They twisted through swamps, over rocky hills, across rivers with no bridges, and through isolated stretches of woodland where a person could disappear entirely and no one would ever know. The great intercolonial road known as the King's Highway, which in theory connected Boston all the way down to Charleston, South Carolina, was not even completed until 1735. Before that, travel between colonies meant navigating disconnected, poorly maintained, and frequently impassable routes. Even after its completion, travelers reported the road was treacherous, choked with tree stumps, flooded in rainy seasons, and lined on both sides by dark, impenetrable forest. Travelers crossing the Susquehanna River in winter were sometimes forced to lead their horses across sheets of ice, while passengers were pulled along on wooden ladders by men who had stripped off their shoes to gain traction. That was the state of infrastructure in what would become the most powerful nation on earth. And what stood between travelers and danger? Almost nothing. In colonial America, formal law enforcement simply did not exist in any meaningful sense. There were no police forces as we understand them today. What colonial society had was a loose patchwork of constables, sheriffs, and night watchmen, all with severely limited reach. Constables handled local disputes within their own jurisdictions. Sheriffs were appointed at the county level and often covered enormous territories on their own. The Night Watch, first organized in Boston around 1636, was largely a volunteer system of citizens who patrolled town streets after dark, and even these watchmen rarely ventured beyond the edges of settlement. Once a traveler stepped beyond the town boundary and into the open road, they entered a zone where the rule of law essentially ended. Out there, on the winding colonial roads, survival depended on your wits, your arms, your companions, and whatever luck the wilderness chose to offer you. The dangers of colonial travel were not abstract or theoretical. They were real, documented, and sometimes unspeakably brutal. Consider the journey undertaken in October 1704 by a Boston woman named Sarah Kemble Knight. She was 38 years old, a boarding house keeper, and one of the few women of her time who dared to travel alone. She set out on horseback from Boston to New York, a journey of roughly 270 miles, and what she recorded in her travel diary reads less like a trip itinerary and more like a survival account. She crossed rivers in the pitch dark with unknown guides who may or may not have been trustworthy. She navigated roads so rough and treacherous that she feared at every turn her horse might stumble and send her tumbling into a ravine. When she finally arrived at a roadside inn late one night, the innkeeper's daughter stared at her in genuine shock and blurted, "I never see a woman on the road so dreadful late in all the days of my life." Knight's journey was not exceptional by the standards of danger on colonial roads. It was exceptional only because she survived it and wrote it down. Inns and taverns were the critical lifeline of the colonial travel network. Spaced roughly every 5 to 10 miles along major routes, they served as far more than just places to eat and sleep. They were information hubs where travelers shared warnings about dangerous stretches of road ahead, where strangers formed informal caravans to travel together in larger, safer numbers, and where innkeepers passed on the latest intelligence about criminal activity in the surrounding region. In Philadelphia alone, nearly 100 licensed taverns were operating by 1731, and by 1750, that number had grown to 120. The tavern common room, with its roaring fire and scattered newspapers, was where a traveler first sized up his fellow guests, figured out who to trust, and decided whether to continue his journey in the morning alone or to wait for a group heading the same direction. That decision, to travel alone or with others, could very literally be the difference between life and death, because lurking beyond those firelit tavern walls, the roads hid men capable of extraordinary violence. No story better captures the raw, lawless terror of the colonial frontier than that of the Harpe Brothers, arguably the most dangerous criminals in early American history, and widely regarded today as the first serial killers the United States ever produced. They were not truly brothers, but cousins, born in what is now Orange County, North Carolina, to Scottish Loyalist families during the tumultuous years preceding the American Revolution. Their given names were Micajah, who went by Big Harpe, and Wiley, known as Little Harpe. Big Harpe was described by contemporary accounts as a large, physically imposing man with a dark and deeply unsettling countenance. Little Harpe was described as leaner, shrewder, and arguably more calculating. Their descent into violence was forged in the fire of the Revolution itself. As loyalists to the British Crown, in a community increasingly consumed by patriot fury, the Harpe family was targeted by revolutionary mobs. The boys reportedly witnessed acts of extreme violence against their own kin and fled into the frontier wilderness of Tennessee and Kentucky, where they were taken in by the Chickamauga Cherokee. They learned to survive in the bush, to hunt, to fight, and to kill. And when the war ended and the new American Republic emerged, the Harpes emerged from the wilderness with it, except they had no intention of becoming citizens of this new nation. They became its predators. By the spring of 1797, the Harpes were operating out of a cabin near Knoxville, Tennessee, having recently been run out of town for stealing livestock. It was around this time that they began their killing spree in earnest. Their method was gruesome and deliberate. They would fall in with unsuspecting travelers on the road, offering companionship and safety in numbers, the very thing every colonial traveler desperately craved, and then they would murder their new companions, disembowel the bodies, fill the cavities with stones, and sink them in rivers so they would never surface. This was not robbery for profit. The Harpes killed for the sheer pleasure of it, a fact that horrified even the hardened outlaws and river pirates of their era. They moved north through Kentucky along the Wilderness Road, the very road that tens of thousands of westward-bound settlers were traveling in search of new lives, leaving a trail of corpses behind them. A man named John Langford was found dead on the road, and a local innkeeper who recognized the body pointed authorities toward the Harpes. A posse gave chase, captured them, and imprisoned them in the state jail at Danville, Kentucky, but they escaped before trial and resumed killing immediately. The governor of Kentucky, James Garrard, placed a bounty of $300 on each of their heads, the equivalent of roughly $7,000 in today's money, but it did little to slow them down. They continued westward, killing men on the trail, slaughtering 3 campers at the mouth of Saline Creek in southern Illinois, and eventually finding temporary refuge at a place called Cave-in Rock, a natural cave above the Ohio River that served as the stronghold of the notorious river pirate and outlaw Samuel Mason and his gang. Samuel Mason himself was no ordinary criminal. A former soldier in the Revolutionary War who had turned outlaw, Mason and his gang terrorized flatboats on the Ohio River and preyed on travelers along the Natchez Trace between 1799 and 1803, robbing and murdering with near-total impunity in a region that had no meaningful law enforcement presence. The Natchez Trace, a roughly 500-mile road connecting Nashville, Tennessee to Natchez, Mississippi, was so notoriously dangerous that experienced travelers refused to journey it alone. Merchants traveling north after selling their goods in Natchez walked a gauntlet of ambush points, river crossings, and isolated stretches of road where robbers could strike and vanish back into the forest before any response was possible. Mason exploited every one of those vulnerabilities. But even Samuel Mason and his gang of hardened outlaws were disturbed by the Harpes. The story passed down through frontier legend and supported by historical accounts, is that the Harpes began taking travelers to the top of the bluffs at Cave-in Rock, stripping them naked, and throwing them off the cliff to their deaths below. Mason reportedly ordered them to leave. When even the most ruthless criminal organization on the Ohio River finds your behavior too extreme to tolerate, you have crossed a threshold of violence that almost defies comprehension. The Harpes' reign of terror finally ended in the summer of 1799 in Webster County, Kentucky, and it ended the way most justice was administered in colonial America, not through courts, not through a police force, but through the raw, grief-driven fury of a community pushed past its breaking point. The Harpes had stopped at the home of a man named Moses Stegall, seeking food and shelter for the night. While there, they murdered an overnight guest, slit the throat of Stegall's 4-month-old infant son when the baby's crying threatened to expose them, and killed Mrs. Stegall herself when she screamed at the sight of her dying child. Then they burned the cabin to the ground and rode off. When Moses Stegall returned home and found the ruins of everything he had loved, he organized a posse and gave chase. They caught up with Big Harpe not long after, shot him in the leg and back, and as he lay bleeding out in the dirt, he confessed to 20 murders. Moses Stegall then took Big Harpe's own butcher knife and, by most accounts, while the man was still conscious, slowly cut off his head. The head was placed on a spike at a road junction in what is now Webster County, Kentucky, as a warning to every other outlaw and road criminal who passed that way. That crossroads is still known today as Harpe's Head Road. Little Harpe escaped, rejoined the Mason gang under false name, and eventually met his own end at the gallows in 1804. His head, too, was spiked along the Natchez Trace. In colonial America, public spectacle was the only police deterrent available. The brutality of what happened to the Harpes was not a malfunction of colonial society. It was the system working exactly as designed, or more precisely, working as well as a society without formal legal institutions could manage. With no police to investigate crimes, no prosecutors to build cases, and no standing army to patrol the roads, communities fell back on the only mechanisms they had: collective fear, collective anger, and collective violence. When someone was robbed on the road in colonial America, the victim could report the crime to a constable or sheriff if they were lucky enough to survive and lucky enough to find one. But more often, the community itself formed posses, issued bounties, and dispensed justice in the most direct way available. The results were sometimes correct. Often they were not. This system produced a society organized around the constant anticipation of danger. Travelers almost never set out alone if they could help it. Instead, they formed groups at taverns, shared intelligence about road conditions and criminal activity, and journeyed together in numbers large enough to deter attack. Merchants carrying valuables traveled with armed companions. Wealthier colonists hired armed escorts or rode in groups specifically organized for mutual protection. Those who could not afford either simply took their chances and hoped. The knowledge that no authority would come to your rescue if trouble found you was not an abstract legal fact. It was a psychological reality that shaped every decision a traveler made, from what time of day to depart, to which road to take, to how many people to bring, to whether they were carrying a loaded pistol or a long rifle slung across their back. It also shaped colonial communities in profound ways. The shared vulnerability of unprotected travel knit communities together through mutual obligation. Innkeepers were expected to warn travelers about known dangers ahead. Communities along major roads maintained informal warning networks where news of a robbery or a dangerous criminal on the loose spread from household to household and tavern to tavern. The hue and cry, an ancient English tradition requiring all citizens to join in pursuing a known criminal, was still very much alive in colonial America because it was still very much necessary. The absence of formal protection forced the creation of informal systems that were, in their own way, deeply communal. People looked out for one another, not simply out of neighborly goodwill, but because the alternative was being left alone in the dark. What is striking is how directly that colonial experience echoes in the conversations we are still having today. Modern debates about community policing, about the role of citizens in their own protection, and about what happens when formal institutions fail or are absent, these are not new conversations. They are very old ones wearing new clothes. When a neighborhood in a modern American city organizes a watch program because residents feel that official law enforcement is not adequate to protect them, they are recreating something their colonial ancestors would have recognized immediately. When debates arise about how much authority individual communities should have to police themselves, historians recognize the fingerprints of a very old and very unresolved tension between formal institutional power and grassroots community action. The difference, and it is a crucial one, is that colonial-era self-protection operated without guardrails. There were no civil rights to protect the accused. There was no standard of evidence required before a posse could form and a punishment could be administered. The speed and informality that made community justice effective in the colonial period also made it capable of horrifying injustice. The wrong person could be named, the wrong head spiked at the crossroads. Today, even as we debate the reach and conduct of police forces, we have built an entire legal architecture designed specifically to prevent the kind of unchecked mob power that was the only alternative in 1799. That architecture is imperfect, contested, and often failing, but its existence marks the distance between what travel in colonial America required of ordinary people and what we expect our society to provide today. There is a road in Webster County, Kentucky. It runs through quiet farmland now, past old trees and wire fences, and to anyone passing through it, looks like an unremarkable rural junction. But its name, Harpe's Head Road, is a monument to the world that existed before police, before courts, before any institution stood between a traveler and the darkness waiting on the other side of the tree line. The colonists who built this country built it through that darkness, under constant threat, without protection, relying on nothing but each other and whatever courage they could summon. Their roads were genuinely deadly. Their world was genuinely lawless. And the institutions we have built since then, however flawed, are the direct answer to exactly that danger. So the next time you merge onto a highway with a patrol car visible in your rearview mirror, think about what it took to make that sight possible and what kind of world existed before it did. If this story of colonial America's lawless roads opened your eyes to a piece of history you hadn't fully imagined before, drop a comment below and tell us what surprised you most. If you want more deep dives into the hidden dangers, forgotten criminals, and untold stories of early American life, hit that subscribe button, because this journey through history is just getting started, and the road ahead has plenty more to reveal.